Hello and welcome to Climate Australia. My name is Lee Constable and you're watching me for a very special National Science Week episode of Climate Australia here on Simpatico TV. So I'd like to start, as I always do, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm broadcasting to you from here in Meanjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, Australia. So right now I'm speaking to you from the land of the Turrbal and Yugara people. So I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people we have joining us here across the nation and across all of the First Nations. And I'd like to acknowledge the integral part that Indigenous people play when it comes to custodianship of the land, sea and sky. The theme of today's event is climate action. We'll be looking at that from so many different perspectives. And of course, there are so many other perspectives that we can't possibly represent in just one panel with just 5 guests. But we do have an amazing lineup of guests. I'd like to first say that we are supported by Inspiring Australia, so thank you to them and the New South Wales Government, as well as Macquarie University. And we're streaming from Simpatico Studios right now, which is the home of Climate Australia. Now I'm going to introduce the panellists. Each panellist will have a few minutes to talk about a major topic on climate action as it relates to their theme. And then that's where you all come in as our audience members. You'll have an opportunity to do some live Q&A, so keep your questions in mind for that section. We've already got some pre-submitted questions. We unfortunately won't get time for all of them, but we will try our best. And at the end of the hour, our guests have actually offered, well, many of them have offered to stick around, so you are welcome to hang out with us after the hour and keep listening to the discussion and asking questions. And of course, there are people joining us on YouTube and Facebook as well, and you will be able to ask your questions there, and we'll see if we have time to get to them all. We'll do our best. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome all of our panelists. Hi, everyone. So good to see you all here. So I'll give you some bio highlights. There is a website though. You can go to climateactionpanel.com to see their full bios. These are some superstars of climate action. So of course, it can't be encapsulated in one little highlights reel. But if I could just give you a brief intro to each, I'll do my best right now. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Lesley Hughes. Here she is. Hi. Lesley is a distinguished professor, not just any professor, of biology, and she is the Pro Vice Chancellor of Research, Integrity and Development at Macquarie University. Lesley's a former Federal Climate Commissioner and lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment reports, and her list of achievements goes on. Welcome, Lesley. And so Lesley will be our first speaker. Our second speaker is Greg Bourne, who I'll just highlight for you here. Now, Greg is a counsellor with Climate Council, and he has worked in the energy industry for over 30 years, including in that time, he was the regional president of BP and the regional president of BP Australasia, I should say. And Greg has spent 2 years also as special advisor on energy and transport to British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, as well as lots of other interesting points in that bio. I encourage you to check the rest of Greg's achievements out. Our third speaker is Tennant Reed. So Tennant, hi. Tennant Reed is the Deputy Director of News and, oh no, I just skipped a bio there. Tennant Reed manages climate, energy and environment policy at Australian Industry Group, or AI Group, you might know them as. Tennant has more than a decade of experience in climate and energy policy design and has published on topics ranging from natural gas to energy efficiency to manufacturing and more. Our fourth guest is Associate Professor Caroline Fisher, and who I will highlight, she's waving there. Caroline is the Deputy Director of News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra. She's also co-author of the annual Digital News Report Australia. And her research interrogates Australians' trust of news media and how media consumption impacts our attitudes to climate change. So you will no doubt have lots of questions for her too. And last but certainly not least, we have Katerina Gaita, who is right here. She is the founder and CEO of Climate for Change, and her expertise are in everything from behaviour change to climate communication. And also through her work on Climate for Change, she has helped reach over 8,000 people, including many in that wavering middle ground when it comes to climate action and understanding. So that's one of the huge challenges we're going to be speaking about when it comes to climate action today too. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Now, first of all, I am going to highlight each one of our guests and their area. Now, you might have seen some themes for tonight. We've got the science theme, we've got business, policy, media, and community change. So there's a lot to talk about. So first up, I'm going to introduce again Professor Lesley Hughes and bring her into the stream. Now, Lesley's major question is one that's going to set the scene for us today. Lesley, would you mind doing us the honour of just telling us this huge picture of what our emissions look like, what our targets look like, and where are we actually at with all that? Are we doing all right? Are we doing terribly? What's it look like?
Well, it doesn't look good, Lee, at all. So if we look at where our emissions come from, about a third of them come from electricity. Transport's about 18%. Stationary energy, which is the energy used in manufacturing and construction, is about 17%. Agriculture's 13%, and there's all sorts of other things like fugitive emissions from gas production and that sort of thing that's about 10%. Australia is a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement, which is good, but the target that we took to Paris is what we call at the Climate Council woefully inadequate. We committed to reducing our emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030, and that target is generally considered on a worldwide basis as totally insufficient. If everybody did what we're doing, or even tried to do what we're doing, we'd be heading for 3 degrees or more. So in terms of whether we're even meeting those rather pathetic targets, we're not. Australian emissions have been going up continually pretty much ever since the price on carbon was removed by the Abbott government. We're on track to be at best about 14 to 16% below 2005 levels by 2030. We could be actually 8% more. And just a couple of days ago, the latest Sustainable Development Report came out, and it rated Australia as 176 out of 177 in terms of climate action. We are second worst only to Brunei, which was the worst. So all in all, a pathetic effort, a pathetic target, and we're not even going to meet that at the moment. Sorry to start with such bad news. Lee, you're on mute.
Rookie error. I thought I wouldn't make that one. But what I was going to say is we have to actually start by knowing the reality, even if it's not a nice one. Otherwise, we're not really going to make it. Thank you so much for setting the scene for us, Lesley. And no doubt we'll have lots more to talk about when it comes to how we actually meet those targets and how we actually turn things around. But for now, I'll move to our next guest. Our next guest is Greg, whose theme is business. Now, if you're like me, you might be wondering, what you could possibly do to impact business and to actually influence business when it comes to climate change. Greg, are there things that people can do that would motivate business to change? Is business interested in cutting carbon emissions?
So I think I'll start with a few of the facts and build on what Lesley said. The 33% coming from electricity and more coming from industry. But let's flip it a slightly different way. If you look at Australia's emissions, they come from 30 companies. 50% of all of the emissions come from 30 companies. And you can give the examples of AGL, Origin, Woodside, Santos, Rio Tinto, and so on. Those companies are emitting. Do they want to reduce their emissions? Up until recently, no. Really what it was about trying to make profit and keep making profit. And if we could push off all of this climate change stuff, that would help. However, finally, we're beginning to see some real movement, the beginnings of real movement, but there's a long way to go, So you have to say, so like, yes, but. And one of the reasons is change is so incredibly difficult for some of the companies. This is not an excuse, it's just a recognition. So if you are, for example, a pure coal company, then climate change and mitigating the emissions is an existential threat to your company. And so what we've been seeing over the last 20 years or 25 years is basically stick to the knitting, make as much money as you possibly can whilst you can, and stave off any particular day where you might get shut down. What motivates companies? Well, obviously, firstly, have they got a strategic future? And if they don't, they're desperate. But if they do have a strategic future, then I would say the biggest motivator is the availability of finance, whether they can get it from equity or they can get it from debt. If they can't get money, you can't grow, you don't create a future for yourself. So that's one of the first things that motivates companies. So a bit of pressure on the financiers helps. And the second one is sticks and carrots from governments. In countries where there have been strong governments on climate change, they have strong sticks and fairly good carrots to cause people to move. Here, pretty limp carrots and pretty limp sticks as well.
Well, that is a perfect segue because our next guest is here to talk about the sticks and carrots. Thank you so much, Greg. And we've got plenty more questions that I can see have already come in for you. Thanks. So our next guest, Tennant, I'm going to bring up now to talk about the sticks and carrots, the regulations, the rewards when it comes to policy, and also where climate action comes in. Now, Tennant, my question for you is one that you probably get a lot. Policy on emissions has obviously been hugely politicised in Australia for decades. How can individuals who might be watching today actually influence government policy on something as big as climate change?
Well, we've certainly talked a lot and fought a lot about climate policy in this country. And I think people from other countries where they've had more visible success in their climate policy achievements, they're sometimes a little confused as to why it has been so hard here and how we've lost so many prime ministers and opposition leaders' careers to this issue. It's not just a matter for PMs and for pointy-head policy wonks. Climate policy is something that we can all have an impact on, and policy matters. Individual action is extremely important, but systems matter, and systems are influenced by many things, but public policy is a big part of it. So the observations that I would make is, one, individuals can influence public policy by engaging with policymakers, by communicating with your parliamentarians, your MPs, your senators, and not just the responsible ministers. In a previous life, I was a public servant, and the public service notes, ministers' offices note, ministers note when they get a lot of communication from the public on a subject. The responses you may get back in the short term may be pretty bland. Thank you for raising this issue with the minister. But the tone and the content and the breadth of input actually is noticed, and it does have an impact over time. Another thing I would say is that people should expect serious climate policy from all parts of the political spectrum. This is an issue that requires successful action over decades. We're a country that has a pretty regular alternation of power, and we need successful action to be sustained in, whatever form, by multiple successive governments. So this is not something that can be just dominated by one side of politics. Also, in terms of attitudes to policy, that the discussion about climate is often, it seems like more a fight between whose technology is best and whose solution is best, and how all the other ones are terrible, than it is an effort to build. And the emissions stats that Lesley reviewed, we have a lot of sources of emissions in this country. We need a lot of solutions to address them. Taking progress and building on it, not walking away, is, I think, quite important. But also, it takes all sorts to get action. Bridge builders definitely have an important niche. And I would just add that on the business question, my organisation represents thousands of businesses around the country. Our members are definitely influenced not just by what investors want and financiers want, but what the customers want and what their employees want. And all of those preferences have been shifting in the direction of seriousness on climate over the last few years.
Yeah, well, it sounds promising hearing from you and Greg that even though these things seem massive and beyond anything an individual could influence, there's not an insignificant amount that individuals can do if we all come together collectively. Thank you so much, Tennant. And of course, we'll have more to hear from Tennant as well. Now we're going to move into the area of public attitudes, because of course, between governments, scientists, businesses, and the public, we often have the media. So I'm just going to bring up Caroline Fisher to talk to us about her specialty, the media. Caroline, you've probably already thought of 1,000 different things from what people are saying and how that intersects with your research. Now, I know that your research is into this baseline info on people's attitudes, the media, and climate change. So could you give us a bit of an overview on what your research tells us in that area?
Sure. So I'm part of a research centre called the News and Media Research Centre at the University of Canberra. And we produce an annual report called the Digital News Report Australia, and we track news consumption trends in Australia and attitudes towards news. And in the 2020 survey, which goes into the field every year at the same time, the end of January, beginning of February, we happened to ask about climate change this year and what people thought about climate change and about the information, where they got their information from about climate change and what their attitudes were about that media. And, the timing of that, of course, was good in the sense that, very relevant in the sense that we were just coming to the end of that terrible bushfire season. And so it was a topical issue. And so given the timing of our survey, it was really interesting. Now, we always survey around 2,000 plus Australian adults who are online. And what we found is kind of good news, is which about 4 out of 5 Australians think that climate change is a problem. But if you break that down a bit more closely, then the figures are not as rosy. So about 58% of our panel, of our survey participants, thought that climate change was extremely or very serious. Around about 21% thought it was somewhat serious, and 18% thought that it wasn't very or at all serious. And when we compare ourselves to other countries, Lesley pointed out earlier that we don't rank so well globally. Well, we don't rank so well globally on this front either. So when it came to people being very or extremely concerned about climate change, we ranked about 30 out of 40 countries in the survey, so quite low towards the bottom. And we ranked very high, third, when it came to people thinking that climate change wasn't serious at all. So we were only behind the US and Sweden when it came to that. One of the other kind of things that stood out for us was that about 15% of people don't pay any attention to news about climate change. And those people tend to be older people, they tend to have lower levels of education, live in regional and rural areas, and tend to be identify with the right side of politics. And like I say, this was quite surprising for us, particularly with that regional finding, given that we've just come to the end of this bushfire season. The other thing that we found was that the concern was very polarised in relation to political orientation and age. So it's very much a young person's issue. Greta Thunberg, bagging boomers is completely appropriate. So it's really clear that Gen Z is by far the most concerned generation. Nearly 50% said it was extremely concerning in comparison to only 20% of people aged 74 and above. So you can see there's this big generational divide, but it's just really not as highly on the radar of older Australians. And again, when it comes to political orientation, so, almost 2/3 of left-wing oriented news consumers think that climate change is very concerning, compared to only 17% of right-wing. And the news brands that people consume reflect their levels of concern. And so maybe this will be my last point. I don't want to talk too long, but, around 35% of people who watch Sky News and Fox and listen to commercial AM radio, they were more likely to think that climate change isn't very serious, compared to only 6% of people who read The Guardian, for instance. So 85%
Wow.
of them think that climate change is very serious.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for painting that picture for us. And I suppose the thing that we're all coming to here is climate action in the end. We want everyone to go away thinking about things that you can do, and they may not be just the things that you've been thinking you could or should or would do. So we're going to come to Katerina now, who's going to bring in the community element and talk to us actually about community change, community impact. Katerina, my question for you is, what are some of the lessons you've learned about the best ways to impact people through your work?
Thank you. So we take the approach, I guess it's quite interesting to hear Caroline speak about the influence of the media. And I guess a lot of the research, my background's in behaviour change and social change, and a lot of the research shows that a lot of the mass media that we consume, whether that's traditional channels like the press or social media, certainly have an influence on our general impressions or sort of the zeitgeist. But when we really decide to take something on board or process information, one of the most common ways that we'll do that is through two-way dialogue with people that we trust. So the approach that we have taken is to find the people who do understand this issue, do care about it and are taking action, and then help them to have better conversations with the people in their networks that trust them. And actually, we've cheated a little bit and stolen the Tupperware party model. So we find hosts, we send a facilitator to their home, they get their friends together in a living room, and we actually make time for this discussion, because I think there are probably three key barriers to why people aren't acting. One is not understanding the urgency of the problem. So even though a lot of people say they're very concerned, when you dig down into it, they know there's something deeply wrong. They are worried, but they have no idea really how wrong or how urgent the issue is. And then secondly, they don't really know what needs to be done or what they can do about it, and they often feel really powerless. And then thirdly, there are a whole lot of barriers in our individual lives that make it hard for us to take action. So through the process of getting people together in a room, making time for them to sit down and process this, and doing it through a two-way dialogue where they can ask questions and we can firstly take them through the urgency of the issue, then what the solutions are, and then really talk about what they can do to make a difference, and get them all to commit to something before they leave. And then we ask everyone to host the next conversation in the next within the next few weeks, so that we can keep reaching more and more people, and growing and reaching exponentially and deeper into communities as well. So that's the approach that we take.
Wow. So obviously today's not just about what we're going to do as individuals, but how we might start some of these conversations with people we care about, or people who care about climate change but don't know what to do. So that's where we're about to head next. Thank you, Katerina. And we'll come back to not just Katerina, but all of our guests. So what we're about to do now is move into more of a live Q&A part of this evening. So this is where we hand the mic to you and you get to ask the questions. So you'll have live chat, whether you're joining us on Facebook Live or YouTube or here within Simpatico on Climate Australia. Feel free to tap out your question. Keep in mind the name of the person. When I bring everyone back on screen, that'll be obvious if it is a question for someone in particular. And we've also got a lot of pre-submitted questions. So I'm going to be reading out some of the questions that you've already sent in, and we've even got one video submission to show. So now I'm going to invite everyone back onto screen. I'll just get you all to join me here. Awesome. And here we are. Thanks so much, everyone. We've set the scene now. Everyone's probably thinking, wow, this is massive. This is big. But I want to take us back to something really fundamental that we probably take for granted. And that's a question that came from Edward. And I'm going to throw this one to you, Lesley. He actually asked, can you actually define what the climate is? And I think we talk about climate change so much, sometimes we forget to define what climate is.
Well, one of the things we like to talk about is the difference between climate and weather. So I can start with talking about what weather is. So weather is what we experience today, tomorrow, yesterday. So it's the kind of instantaneous combination of the temperature and whether it's raining and how windy it is and that sort of thing. When we look at trends in weather over time, we usually talk about climate as what's happened over 30 years worth of weather. So climate, it doesn't really make sense to talk about the climate today or the climate tomorrow. That's really weather. But climate is a longer term collation or trend of all of those trends: temperature trends, rainfall trends, solar radiation, etc., etc. So when we talk about climate change, we're talking about that sort of 30-year, 3-decadal change in what we're experiencing. Usually we talk about it as an average. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's well, if Edward's in the audience, you can always type into the chat if you've got any follow-up questions. But yeah, I think that's a really nice summary. Thank you. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you all one of our video submissions that we've had for you to watch. And it's a really all-encompassing question, and it comes from Richard. So here we go, Richard.
I'm sure you're all acutely aware of the difficulties in educating the public, let alone politicians, about less visible environmental issues. So my question is, in an arena where environmental NGOs are often pitted against more powerful transnational corporations, what successful strategies are there to take on well-funded lobby groups like the fossil fuels?
Yeah, so first I might throw to you, Greg, if that's okay.
Sure. So having worked for one of the largest fossil fuel companies in the world, but then also having been the CEO of WWF Australia for 6 years, it's been on both sides of the fence. So the first thing I would say is I tend to divide the world into sort of people who, it's not like traffic lights, red, orange and green. There are some red companies that don't even bother talking to. All you do is you waste your energy. And to some extent, the ones that are green that are actually trying to move along, well, work with them, be alongside them. The most fruitful area is working with the companies that are sort of equivocating. Which way shall I go? Which way shall I go? And trying to find, common themes. So in many cases, we've seen organisations like WWF, the Australian Conservation Foundation, the Wilderness Society, working alongside the very big companies like the BHPs, the Rios, the BPs of this world, working together. Finally, I'd say there are other parts of the NGO world who put the flag so far out there, you don't know how to get there. But we need them desperately, because unless you know what you're striving for, you don't know how to start. So, lots of different folks, but don't waste your time on those who I describe as are red. They can't change, they won't change.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to bring in Katerina here. Now, you have reached a lot of people in that wavering middle ground. Is that because you were targeting people in that wavering middle ground?
Yeah. We So I guess our approach is to reach people through their peers. So when we have a host, we have facilitators who are trained volunteers who work with their hosts to invite a good mix of people to their conversation. And we very much ask them to, don't bring the activists. They're already there. Don't bring the deniers. We're not going to convince them. We need the people in the middle. So we're trying to find, probably we try and sort of have about 2 or 3 people at the conversation who are what we call active. So they're concerned, they're taking some action, but they're not sort of going to put everyone off by being too extreme. Then some people who we call passive, who are definitely concerned about the issue and probably doing things at home, recycling, keep cups, those sorts of things, but haven't taken sort of bigger action than that. And then some people, about a third, who we call wavering. So people who would say that they're concerned about climate change, but then every time you suggest a solution like a carbon tax or anything like that, they'll say, oh, maybe not that might be too extreme. So they're the group that we're specifically trying to reach. And our data shows that that's pretty much who we're reached. That 90% of our audience falls within those 3 categories pretty evenly. Yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a bit of overlap between talking to businesses as well as individuals, because you're really thinking about who you are as the messenger, who they are as the audience. So I wanted to bring Caroline in here and also say we've got a question that's just come in through our live chat from Ken, which is along these lines as well, about should we even bother messaging adults that have politicized viewpoints about climate change reality, or should we focus on younger generations that are ready and willing to take action? What would you say how does that fit into what your research says?
Look, I kind of agree with what Katerina's saying. I think that, young people, we can see that they really care about this. This is a, generational issue. It's a young person's issue. It's their Vietnam, in a way. It's their big issue. So I don't think that there's trouble converting the young and getting them active. And I've got 2 teenage kids, and they take the day off school to go on marches. I mean, they're very engaged on this, so I don't think that's the problem. I think it is the middle ground, and I think that one of the things that we see, and particularly in our research about media, is that the media is very polarised on this. We have quite divided media along political lines, and it's that middle ground of kind of reasonable. I don't want to use the word balance, because that's that's a difficult word in relation to climate change coverage. But but calm and solid and and reasonable coverage of the issue, I think, is what is needed to reach these middle ground people who are just teetering, who aren't quite committed yet to do something about it.
Yeah, and I saw Tennant's keen to jump in as well. Tennant?
Yeah, there's a saying attributed to the scientist Max Planck: science progresses one funeral at a time. The problem with that intellectual journey approach with climate and just waiting for younger people with different views to take their place in the positions of power and so on is we actually don't have a lot of time to wait for that. We need to be doing stuff on a sustained basis for many decades. And so reaching out to people who are middle-aged, as I am now, or older, is very important. And one thing that does make a difference is when people can see practical pathways for making the transition to net zero emissions. And I remember 10 years ago, when I was very early in my current role, the energy sector in Australia didn't see that pathway, was pretty resistant to a more aggressive pace of change. Some of the people who were most resistant then run solar businesses now. They can see a way to prosper in a net zero world. And the more people across the economy see that their lifestyle can be sustained, that their business doesn't need to go under, the more we'll be perfectly comfortable with a well-managed transition.
Now, speaking of transition and energy, I'm going to throw to you, Lesley, just giving you a warning before I do, but we've had a question submitted by Jenny, who asked, about hydrogen, and there's a lot of discussion going on about hydrogen, and there seems to always be, whenever we go to talk about renewable energy, lots of other what about this discussions. What would you say when it comes to people who are asking about whether gas is the answer, whether hydrogen is the answer, whether nuclear, because we're getting a lot of our pre-submitted questions that are kind of along those lines?
Well, I'll have a first go, and then I might throw to Greg as well, because he's probably more expert on this than me. Let me start with gas, because that's the hot topic at the moment, and say very categorically that gas is not a benign substance. It's a fossil fuel, just like coal. And in fact, some gas production is worse in terms of emissions than coal, because there's the fugitive emissions from methane being produced as well. And methane is about 22 times as bad a greenhouse gas as carbon dioxide, and it stays around for a lot longer. So gas is not the answer. There is gas in the system now. We will have to transition out of that, but the really important thing, and this goes against what the government at the moment is pushing, is that we cannot afford to have new gas infrastructure, especially paid for by the taxpayer, because then that locks us into very expensive, potentially stranded assets in the long term. So no new gas is the answer. Gas is just as bad as coal. In terms of hydrogen, well, we can produce hydrogen as a fuel source, but you can produce it, you need an energy source to make the hydrogen. And so if you use renewables to make it, that's good. If you use fossil fuels to make it, well, that's just as bad as burning the coal and the gas in the first place. In terms of nuclear, you know, a lot of people say, oh, well, what about nuclear? Most of the problems with nuclear, there's political problems. You know, there's no electorate in Australia that would agree to having a nuclear power plant in the backyard. Nuclear plants, the traditional ones, are very, very expensive, take a long, long time to build. And so even if we started building one now and spent all that money, by the time they came online, you know, the cost of solar and wind, which is already cheaper than most fossil fuels in most circumstances, would make it not viable. So you just wouldn't get a bank providing capital for a nuclear power station. So even though it is no emissions, there's all sorts of other practical reasons why I just don't think it's going to happen. But maybe I'll throw to Greg now to add his more significant expertise on all of those topics.
Let me just start from my time in BP. So back in sort of 95, we were the first large company to say climate change is real, it's a real problem, we're going to have to change. So strategically, BP sold all of its coal by about 98 or something like that. Got out of all the coal, got out of all the heavy oil, got out of all the tar sands, bought into gas. But you could actually see that that was a problem, so bought into renewables as well. That stuttered a bit, but nevertheless. So in the end, you know, even now I would still say the role for gas, the remaining role for gas, is to kill off coal and then to kill itself. Kill off coal and then kill itself. No more exploration, no more new pipelines. We don't need to do that. But we do have to speedily transition. We do have to speedily transition with renewables, battery storage, pumped hydro storage. All those sorts of things have to go along at the same time, strengthening our transmission lines, our distribution lines. As long as you decide that you're going to do it, we can do it with no more gas. On hydrogen, hydrogen has a big future, particularly for Australia. We could go into it for a very long time, but it's a big, big, big future for Australia. We've got a continent, we have a lot of sun, a lot of wind, and very few people. We are in a very, very good position on hydrogen.
Okay, well, I am going to throw to Tennant now, but Tennant, keep in mind this is about climate action. So hopefully you'll have some tips for people, given that we've had this, the scene set by Lesley and Greg on what the way forward is. How do everyday people kind of help influence policy around that, business around that, from your perspective?
Well, I would just add to the foregoing to say that there is, nothing is the solution to climate change, because there are a lot of sources of emissions. As we've noted, electricity is just a third of Australia's current emissions. The use of electricity is probably going to expand a lot as part of the solution. But we've got to deal with agriculture, with fugitive emissions, which are also from mining, with transportation, which has got many different subsectors to it. So, in some ways that can feel overwhelming, but it also means there are a lot of ways to chip away at this problem. There are a lot of opportunities to make a difference in different parts of it. You don't need to consider that, well, renewables are going to be huge, and they are going to be huge. Whether they are 100% of the answer or 80% of the answer, they will be gargantuan. But there's going to need to be a lot of other solutions found. And the things that I'm hearing from the ag sector about seaweed additives to cattle feedstock, the opportunities for not just hydrogen but synthetic fuels or battery electric for heavy transport, for short distance aviation. Like, there's a lot of stuff to be done. So getting out there and participating in some of those solutions, being a market for, like, an early adopter for low emissions and zero emissions and negative emissions products and materials, which will increasingly be coming to market. Being an early adopter of batteries is a very useful thing, and of electric vehicles, which is, you still are an early adopter in this country if you've got one. But there's a lot of other frontiers, plant-based meats. There's a lot of things that you can do with your power as a consumer and as a model to the people the people in your family of, yes, there are, it's not just a question of self-denial and wearing a hair shirt. You can live a modern and fulfilling lifestyle while minimizing your impact on the planet.
Yeah, and I suppose we do often talk about these things like they're two separate things: individual action and policy change or business change. But you are voting with your literal vote at the poll, but you're voting with your wallet, you're voting with your actions and what you say culturally and socially. So I suppose I wanted to throw to Katerina and Caroline on that. We've had some of their questions come through when it comes to, a lot of people are asking about these practical everyday things about electricity and housing and efficiency around the house, about whether we decide to fly and what we decide when we want to fly. Do you think there's value in making individual actions, but like doing it loudly on social media, or, subtly just putting it into your coffee conversation? Or what is it that actually turns this from something that seems like an extreme, far out way to live versus something that's just a normal way that we are good citizens? Start with you, Katerina.
I'm happy to jump in. I think I'd start by saying one of our volunteers said recently, or actually it was just after War on Waste came out, so it was a while ago now, and they said rhetorically, what's more powerful, 50,000 people taking their own bags to the supermarket, or 50,000 people writing to their politicians to get plastic bags banned? And I think when you think about it that way, that it's pretty obvious what the bigger impact is. And so I think for me, like when I realized that I could spend my whole life agonizing over every single decision that I made and still fail because I'm in a broken system, or I could put more of my effort to fixing that system. And when it's fixed, all the things I'm trying to do would be so much easier because the system would be encouraging me to do that. I think that would be the very first point I'd make. That's not to say it's not important and good to do individual actions. And particularly, as you say, I think a great way to do, a good reason to do them is because it sets a norm for others to think about caring for our planet as something we all should and could be doing. Certainly, we know that one of the most powerful ways to have a conversation about climate change is to talk about what you're doing and then talk about the problem through that. So talk about why you're doing this action and what impact you hope it will have. So certainly doing any action is helpful in bringing others on board, but I'd certainly think about what percentage of your efforts are going towards big system change that's going to make a really big difference, and what percentage is going to go towards other items.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So Caroline, I've just got a question here on the live chat for you. What have been some extremely powerful climate action public awareness campaigns that have really impressed you?
Gosh, that wasn't the question I was thinking I was going to get.
Or you can answer the one you wanted to get as well.
Well, in fact, nothing readily comes to mind. So maybe there is one, but it's not top of mind. Look, it seems to me, I mean, from a media perspective, one of the problems with climate change is that there is this kind of compassion fatigue. There is news fatigue. And it's pretty grim, and a lot of the reporting on it is sensational. It's the end of the world, and water's rising, and everyone's been. It's we're all drowning, and burning, and so there's only so much you can cope with. And at the moment, in particular, I mean, COVID-19 has just knocked everything off the news agenda. It's hard to get anything up. At the moment, it's just about COVID, so it's particularly hard to get through messages about other issues. But I do think generally, I think environmental stories and the climate change story. It has been bubbling along there for a long time, but because it's this slow-moving thing to try and actually get traction and attention that lasts longer than one news cycle is really hard. I think that, a lot of the criticism that people have about news media and why they turn away from it, I mean, increasingly people are avoiding the news because they find it upsetting, they find it negative, they feel powerless to do anything about the stuff that they hear about in the news. There's quite a push now coming from America and from Europe for more constructive journalism or solutions journalism. There's different types of names for it, where, like you say, Katerina, people pointing to successes, small achievements, stuff that is doable, is a really good thing to do. And it doesn't mean that you avoid the problem, but you do say, hey, this is a huge problem, but actually that country over there is dealing with it really well, or that person's, found a really great way of doing something about it. And I do think that that would help potentially people's feeling of powerlessness and perhaps help them not avoid the news so much about this topic, because it's pretty depressing.
And I will say this event actually was organised by Dr. Kate Selway, who, as a scientist who's quite aware of climate change from the science perspective, felt to some extent disempowered as on an individual perspective and confused, and there's so overwhelmed by the problem, and was thinking, I'm not the only one. Lesley, do you find that some of your colleagues, even in science, often feel like they're not up to speed on how they can influence, things like politics?
Sure, and I'd love more of my science colleagues to be more activist. I'm a proud activist, and activism can be a dirty word in science because it smacks of lack of objectivity, but my attitude and other scientists have said to me, well, I couldn't go out and do media like you do because I feel that my credibility as an objective scientist would be threatened. And I say, well, look, if you trust the science, if you understand the science, and if you do that, you know how serious the situation is. So in all conscience as a person, how can you do anything but be an activist for science-based policy? And that's all we're asking for, not ideology, but actually evidence-based policy. So I would love more of my fellow scientists to come out and do that. And I think they are. But it's a scary space out there in the media if you're a climate change scientist or a climate change commentator, but I think that's changing.
And Tennant, when you see, the different ways that people as individuals are making a difference, do you think that people's professions, like whether they're medical doctors or scientists or emergency services, people we've seen talk about climate change, does that make a difference to a politician's mind?
Well, I think that definitely hearing from diverse people that this is not just something that, of course they would say that, it is important, but it's also important because climate it's a really big issue. There are so many different angles to it, ways of impact that will be felt, that you really need many, many different disciplines, life backgrounds, regional experiences to be brought to it. And part of the impact of that is that, yes, you do find that something that you didn't expect will make a difference, will cut through in a way that maybe if people are in a very entrenched point of view on what, you know, the right way to get energy is or isn't, impacts or discussions about impacts on the reef is very discussed, but impacts on your own local wilderness, impacts on like the heat stress that people in your city are going to experience. That can make a difference if it's coming from a much broader diversity of people than the usual suspects.
And now we are coming up to the top of our hour. If you are watching on Facebook or YouTube, you will be able to stick around with us on the live stream because we're going to go to some credits and then we'll come back after to keep chatting. Before we get to the top of the hour though, I wanted to give each of you the opportunity to give a takeaway message. If someone was watching who was just thinking, oh, what do I take away from all this? What would you hope from your different various areas, expertise, experience that someone might consider doing as an individual to impact those structures, whether it's in their backyard or more broadly? I'll start with you, Katerina.
Can I cheat and say we've got a list of things on our website?
Yeah, go for it.
So at climateforchange.org.au, take action. You can find a whole list of actions that you can take to change the system and groups that you can join or donate to. Not just ours, lots of groups. We try and put as many on there as possible so that you can find the best action that will change the system that suits you, whether it's writing to a politician or changing your money, moving banks, changing your super. There's lots of ways you can change the system.
Awesome. And it sounds like there's something for everyone, whether you're not sure what to do, but you've got some dollars to spare, or whether you don't have the dollars, but you've got the passion and an email address. That's awesome. So Tennant, I might throw to you for your wrap-up comments.
So I think I would just say that if we've learned one thing over the past couple of decades, it's that actually solving this problem, as big a problem as it is, as many angles as it has, it's easier than we thought it was. It's going to be cheaper than we thought it would be, and that the speed with which our tools have gotten better and cheaper should give us the confidence not to relax and slow down, but to go faster and to be confident that we can solve the remaining technical and economic challenges that we've got, as well as we have, even with all the problems in our national and global responses over the past couple of decades. We have made quite a lot of progress, and if we build on that, we will be able to solve this problem.
Awesome. That sounds very optimistic. So leading on from that, Lesley, what are your takeaway messages for people?
Well, I'll take two. So referring back to what Carolyn said at the beginning, she said from her research, 58% of people in Australia are very concerned about climate change. Well, imagine if 58% of the population of voting age voted for the candidate in their electorate that has the best climate policy. You would have an instant change. So number one. My number two is, and Katerina's mentioned a whole lot of things, but I listened to an interview with the CEO of AGL the other day. I'm afraid I can't remember his name, but he said, look, he was talking about the closure of the Liddell power station, coal-fired power station, in a few years' time. And he said, if every single one of our customers said they wanted green power, we'd have to close that station tomorrow because we couldn't sell the power. So I thought, well, wow, green power is a little bit more expensive, but it's not as expensive as putting panels on your roof. If everybody switched to green power, nobody could sell us coal-fired electricity anymore. That would be pretty big.
That'd be big and also possible. Okay, so Greg, what would you say?
We're in the time of COVID, so I thought I'd think about that. So the economists used to say that they were worried that if we took action on climate change, it would cost us a loss of 10% of our global GDP by the year 2100. That's the equivalent of 0.1% change per annum. And yet here we are, we have spent probably 2.5% of our GDP, 8% of our GDP in other countries to tackle one particular problem which desperately needs tackling. Where there's a will, there's a way. We can actually tackle climate change and tackle it really well, but we have to have that will. I think Katerina's points about messaging going out, whether it's a plastic bag or whether it's actually changing the system, becomes key. The point of the system, which I think we can all do, is the finance side. Sort of speak to your superannuation fund, your bank. They are changing things really fast now, and even politicians are telling them off, and that's a good sign.
And again, another very possible one to do. It's much easier to change to a fossil fuel-free bank or super fund than you think, is what I'll say as someone who's done that. Now, Caroline, you've got the final wrap up.
Look, I'd really encourage people to reach outside their bubble, to seek quality information sources about climate change, and then to share them. And to really try and be respectful and tolerant of people who may not share your view. But if you're not going to engage with them, you're not going to change their mind. And so we really have to break down this kind of combative, us and them, polarisation on this issue, because we're not going to go anywhere. And if you're on social media, don't pile on, but respectfully, exchange with people. We've really got to have a respectful debate and respect the fact that people have different perspectives. I've had emails from farmers and things after my report, telling me about their perspective and why they think what they think. And, it needs to be respected, not pilloried by a left-wing, newspaper or activist. We need to build respect and tolerance and understanding. So I would say, please read news sources that you don't normally read, that challenge your perspective, and open your mind to try and see it from the other person's perspective. Only then will you find the cracks where the influence can happen. The other thing I would really urge people to do is to pay for news and pay for the brands that are doing the quality work on climate change, and then share that work. Because journalism is expensive, investigative journalism is expensive, and we must pay for it. The only free press is the one you pay for. And if we want quality media about climate change, then we all have to put our hands in our pockets.
I love that message, especially as someone who's interested in climate media, as I am. Vested interest in that message. Thank you so much, everyone. And like I said, if you're on the chat, please stay with us if you've still got questions, because our panelists have generously offered to stick around and answer more of them. And I can see there's even more coming in. We're going to be overwhelmed and here all night, but we're going to have more of a chat at least. But first, I just wanted to thank the organiser of this event, Dr. Kate Selway. I wanted to thank Macquarie University, Inspiring Australia, and the New South Wales Government, and Simpatico Studios for all their behind-the-scenes work in producing this evening. Thank you so much. And thanks for joining me here on Climate Australia. And this will be a place where I hope you'll come for more news that gets paid for by people on climate, that is reliable, and hopefully we can all join together and find the different ways that we can contribute to climate action, not just as individuals, but as people who can feed into that whole system. So thanks so much, everyone. Now I'm just going to sign off from this. You'll get some credits for a little while, and then we'll be right back for more live Q&A. media, ironically, but we thank her very much for her time. If your questions are coming in about the media, don't worry though, because we've got plenty of people who've spent a lot of time talking to the media and about the media with us today as well. So I'll just go to some of the pre-submitted questions. Because there are a lot. Some of the things we've already talked about, which hit on so many of these questions. One thing that came in that I wanted to touch on was this cultural shift to the green economy. We've historically been progressive with lots of issues, women's rights, cigarettes. What's missing with climate change? Oh, I don't know. You might not even agree with us having been progressive on those issues necessarily. Maybe you've all got a different take on that, but that question comes from Kristen. So I'll throw to you, Greg. Put you on the slide.
So the question of the green economy, when I was sort of in the oil business, as it were, people weren't really even talking about the green economy. They were talking about the beginnings of solar and the beginnings of wind and so on like that. It has become an all-encompassing word, but I think we will actually leave that behind. It just becomes the economy. We are going to invest heavily in wind, solar, batteries. We're going to do that. We are going to be investing heavily in new tillage platforms for agriculture. We're going to be investing in water pumping in different ways for agriculture. We will electrify pretty much everything. So it then just becomes the economy, and people will eventually write from history, the green movement moved the economy. I'm very excited by it, and most importantly, I think entrepreneurs everywhere are, not that I'm an entrepreneur, but entrepreneurs everywhere are really driving some significant changes, and we will just see it as the economy. And it used to be a phrase about, the people who run the current economy are stale, pale, and male. Well, I fit all of those categories, but I'm very definitely in the new economy.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It seems that there's a lot of discussion happening around green economy, not just here in Australia, but elsewhere. It's not a new discussion, but do you think that COVID has given this discussion extra fuel or extra oomph, or given people extra examples to point to as to why we should be doing that? Tennant, you might want to jump in, and Lesley.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting angles in the impact of COVID. So a lot of people and a lot of organisations, certainly including mine, are highlighting the benefits of an emphasis on clean recovery, on to the extent that we need stimulus and public policy to support our recovery out of the economic crisis that we are in. It should accelerate us to where the new sources of growth and conditions for a better form of prosperity in the future are likely to come from. And one of those important areas is zero, negative and low emissions technology. So that's really important. But another thing is that we've seen that contraction of the economy or degrowth, at least generic degrowth, is it's a pretty rotten way to cut emissions. We've suffered a lot in this country. Other countries suffering even more. Emissions are down a bit. We need to find cleaner ways and completely clean ways to do everything. We can't just do less. But the exception to that is in transport. We are seeing tonight how much more we can do with telecommuting, with telecommunications, with online engagement than we used to think we could. And I dearly hope that tourism is going to come roaring back when the health situation is under control. But I don't think that business travel is going to recover, certainly not to the levels that it was at. I think there really is going to be a difference in how people commute, how people live their lives. We'll be getting what we need professionally and in terms of our interactions, but with less need to dig stuff up or burn stuff to make that happen.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on something you were talking about, because we had a message come in, I think it was from Facebook Live, from Carol Devine, who first of all said, "Scientist, activist, terrific, Lesley." Obviously, someone else is on board there with that, which is great. And then Carol goes on to ask about capturing our adaptation lessons from the carbon crash during COVID-19 travel restrictions. Lesley, do you think that that's actually a thing that you've seen a difference in when it comes to the way you even do your job as a scientist? Or was it something that climate scientists and people related to climate science were already well ahead of other people going to conferences and things like that?
Look, I think climate scientists going to conferences until COVID were still using a lot of carbon. I mean, they might have been offsetting their flights, but, we'd think nothing really of flying to Melbourne for a meeting. And I think, as Tennant says, we've discovered all these ways of actually saving a hell of a lot of time, let alone carbon and money. So, yeah, I don't think we'll go back to the jump on the plane to Melbourne for a meeting anytime soon. I think for there's three other really important lessons from COVID. I think if you think about the countries that have done better, I mean, nobody's done perfectly, but if you think about the countries that have done better at controlling the pandemic versus those that have done worse, there's three things those countries have done. Firstly, they've listened to experts. They've got the health officers out there in front of the microphone, and they've said, well, this is what they're telling us, and that's what we're going to do. They've acted early. They haven't waited till things got out of control like the US did. And they've prioritised the threat, the real threat, over everything else. And when those three things have been done, think of Jacinda Ardern and what she's done in New Zealand. And okay, they've still got a few little problems, but compared to most countries, really nothing. Those three things are exactly what needs to be done with climate. You listen to the experts, you act as soon as you know there's a problem, and you prioritise that threat. And, the fact is that even when we're all vaccinated and COVID is a thing of the past, climate change is still going to be with us for a very, very, very long time. And so I think we need to remember those lessons.
I also wanted to ask Katerina, because I had a question that came in on the live chat about mobilising different communities to change practices and policies within communities. The example given was churches, and potentially there are other communities that you can focus on as mini structures. Is that something that your organisation has been working on?
We don't have a particular community that we're targeting, and we thought actually long and hard about this, and it's not that that's not a good strategy. That's a really, really good strategy. It's just that there are lots of organisations out there that are better suited to those communities than we are, because we're not from those communities. You really, you need trusted messengers. That's absolutely key. So what we have started to do is work with organisations. We're talking to Jewish Climate Network at the moment, and a couple of other organisations that are working with particular communities, and we'll help them adopt the model that we have developed so that they can run it for themselves, because they'll do a much better job in their community than we ever would. So yeah, that's our approach. Rather than us go in there, we give people the tools to do it themselves.
Yeah, and how often is that the case, do you find, in other areas? Greg, for instance, would you find in business it's a similar thing where potentially it's about recognising that you're not the messenger, but you can be a messenger to someone who's the messenger? Or is that often something that happens when it comes to changing things in corporations?
It's very interesting in corporations. Some work I and some others did a while ago on the ASX 200 was to look at all the chairs and CEOs to see whether the twinning of that pairing was conducive to taking action on climate change. And sad to say, it was about 10 or 15 of the top 200, the pairings were right. And it's just because sometimes a company's about to be taken over, it's doing a takeover, or this particular chair would never think about it, even though the CEO was. It's really hard sometimes for changes to come about. So for people like myself, who are, if you like, business but activists, side of things, one of the biggest roles that we have, believe it or not, is talking to the person who is a CEO or a chair who is sort of on the fence, and they ask you the questions that they've never been allowed to ask anyone else because they're meant to know every answer, and actually helping them across that divide. Because if you can get a CEO and a chair at the same time to move forward, you just have to look at BHP now moving forward, you can then really begin to move things. So picking very carefully who you are going to talk to, and Katerina's phrase, the trusted messenger, I think becomes really, really key. But just picking wisely, you can actually move mountains. You really can move mountains. Finding out which one you have to do, though, is a bit harder. And time.
And Tennant, would you have any advice along those lines if people are thinking about approaching politicians, whether they should talk to their local council people or their federal member or the senator in their electorate? How do you actually go about tackling that as an everyday person who maybe isn't quite sure where to begin and which buttons to push and which places might actually not be doors you can knock on but brick walls?
I think that spreading your bets is a good idea. Talking to or communicating with a broad range of parliamentarians is important. Often, not always, but often the minister most responsible probably is not the person who most needs to hear what's going on in climate or the extent of community concern about climate. They get a lot of advice on that from their department. The people who need to hear it are their cabinet colleagues, their backbench, the people who don't get as much exposure to the issue and may be operating off a set of assumptions or data points that are pretty out of date. So communicating with people on all sides of politics is important. I do think that all levels of politics matter. We pay a lot of attention to federal politics. States make a lot of decisions that are relevant to climate, particularly around land use, transport system planning. It's not just about the federal government, but the federal government definitely matters.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have seen that tension and separation of responsibility between state and federal, first of all, this year with the bushfires and the whole discussion around whose responsibility is it, given that emergency services come under the states, but it's a national crisis. And now again, we're in a national crisis. It's part of an international crisis, and we've got this whole states deal with health and their borders and things like that. I was wondering if that actually presents us, we've had a few questions along these lines when it comes to state and federal. I was wondering if that actually presents more of an opportunity or a challenge to people.
Federation is hard. There's others definitely jump in, but the success so far of this new national cabinet approach has been very heartening after many decades of premiers conferences and COAG meetings where you could often not see a lot coming out of them, but it is always hard to get coordination sustained in federal systems. The states can be laboratories of democracy and try out lots of things, but some things really you want some consistency and coherence in the national electricity market. Businesses, whether they're energy users or energy suppliers, are a little bit aghast at that fragmenting into a patchwork of completely different rules, but getting unanimity is a high bar.
It is a high bar. I think we can all see how high that bar has been set, or maybe we're just making it out to be a high bar. It sounds like you're all saying it's not so high as we think, and we'll clear it if we push the right buttons. Lesley, I wanted to ask you about, from your perspective, is there anything that you think everyday people watching could do to make your life easier?
Be informed, I think. I'll give a plug to the Climate Council. Greg and I are both councillors there, and we set up the Climate Council to be a credible voice of climate change information to the general public. And there's a huge amount of resources on our website, including really engaging little videos and heavier reports and all sorts of things in between. So I think, be informed. And I think join a group. I think, climate can feel such a big problem, and people can feel really disempowered when they're just sort of sitting at home and shouting at politicians on the TV. If you join a group of like-minded people, and Katerina just said, her website has a whole lot of groups. There'll be a group near you of similar people that you can relate to, and that's a lot more powerful and a lot more empowering than being on your own.
And I should say, the climateactionpanel.com website is where, keep an eye on it. If you happen to be watching the recording back of this, then click that link, because Kate's going to also be putting links to Katerina's website and to other resources. And obviously the Climate Council is a huge resource in itself and has lots of resources on their website. So that's great. Any other resources actually anyone on the panel wants to point people to?
I'll give a plug for the Australian Climate Roundtable, and www.australianclimateroundtable.org.au, which hosts the principles for how we should be approaching the policy side of this, agreed by business orgs, environment orgs, unions, farmers, social welfare, and I won't give any spoilers, but we hope to make some more statements next week, which will be on that site.
Great. Awesome. I was also thinking of one, market forces can be a good one to look at if you're particularly thinking, I don't know what I can change in my everyday life. I'm a bit busy and overwhelmed, but maybe I can think about where my super goes, or who I bank with, or who I get a home loan from, or any of those things. That can be a way that, it may not seem like you're doing anything differently on the surface, but Market Forces is a really good website for having a look into your bank or your super fund and others, and comparing their kind of track record when it comes to investing in fossil fuels and environmental initiatives. Yeah, I think for a lot of these resources as well, after this, I'll be linking to within Simpatico for anyone who's already signed up for Simpatico. I should say as well, on Climate Australia, I'm hoping this will be a place where people can come for resources, because we'll be able to share them. It's free for any members to join up. It's basically launching next month, but we've done some pilot episodes, which this is one of. And I'll be interviewing expert guests all the time from across disciplines, and trying to, I guess, make it a place where we can share information with each other and have more collective impact, and stop reinventing wheels and by borrowing other people's wheels and making them bespoke. So I will post all these resources as well below for anyone who might be watching on Simpatico too. And I think this brings us almost to the end of the half hour. We've got lots of other questions that all come back to similar things that you've all tackled when it comes to these resources and your go-to messages around your area. Any final words before we go? for everyone at home?
Don't give up. Oh, sorry, Katerina, after you.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, look, it can feel overwhelming. Don't give up. Hope is a strategy, and we have to have hope. If we don't have hope and optimism, then we give up, and then we're stuffed. So stay hopeful, but we need to work hard, and we need to prioritise this. It's actually the most important thing we could be doing.
Yeah, if I can segue straight off Lesley there, I look at the word hope very, very strongly, but I also twin it with action and ingenuity, because there's a flip side of hope. Hope can actually allow you to sit on your hands. You hope it'll be all right. Should be right, mate. I hope it is anyway. So you have to have action and ingenuity, and the ingenuity to me is this forward-looking. Let's create new economies. Let's make things really, really work well. So hope, action, and ingenuity.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I actually think hope is a
Katerina.
Oh, sorry. I'd echo that. I actually think optimism is that Lesley, she'll be right attitude, and hope actually calls on us to realise that hope. It's the idea of a sprig in the pavement, but that sprig will only grow into a tree if we water it. And when I think about all the people who do care about climate change, if all of those people were active and talking to other people about what they're doing, we'd get where we need to go in no time. We know the problem, we've got the solutions, all we lack is the action. So we all just have to, I think you asked Lesley what would make her life easier, and I often when people say to me, you work so hard, you're so tired all the time, I just think, well, if everybody else just did a little bit more, then I wouldn't have to do so much. So please go out. I wanted to say one of our volunteers actually set up sort of letter writing groups that you can join through our website as well. So if you've never written to a politician before, it's a great way to start. She does them online at the moment, and you can join with a glass of wine or your favourite beverage or a cookie or whatever it is, and smash out a few letters, and it feels really empowering.
Awesome. I love that. Hope, ingenuity, optimism, but not to the point where we don't do anything, reaching out to each other. Tennant, you're going to round it all off.
Well, I will give a little bit of hope and a little bit of caution. Over the past 10 years or 11 years more, climate issues in Australia have been a real roller coaster. Whenever it seems like things are particularly bleak and in the pits, a turn to rising action has been just around the corner. But equally, whenever it seems like things are going particularly well, buckle up, because something interesting is about to happen. So don't get too relaxed. The climate doesn't go away, no matter what our news cycles and our other concerns are doing. So just stay engaged and keep trying to make a difference.
Ride the wave, whether you're on the way up or the way down. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. And I'll say goodnight to you all. Thank you so much for sharing with us, answering so many questions. You've started a lot of conversations, I'm sure, as well as actions tonight. Thank you very much, and good night. And to everyone else, thank you for joining us. And I'll see you next time, hopefully. And happy National Science Week. And thank you so much to Inspiring Australia, Kate Selway, Macquarie University, and of course, Simpatico. Good night.